What is up, everybody? Coach Juma here, and this is part 2 of the training program series. Last week we talked about how to design a training program and what that looks like from a zoomed out perspective. Now we're getting into the nitty gritty and trying to understand what the goals are of each individual training day and each exercise that you're doing.
Nitty gritty sounds like a racial slur.
Nitty gritty.
You stupid nitty. It sounds horrible, dude. You stupid nitty gritty. Jesus Christ, why is that so bad?
I don't know, but it's hilarious. That could be a good skit. So now you know how to design your training program, but what are you actually doing in those sessions? One of the questions I get most often with new onboarding clients starting a program for the first time, they get the exercise that they're doing, they get the sequence of it, they know the sets and reps that they're doing, how much rest time to have, but they don't know how much weight they should be lifting. And whether your goal is hypertrophy or your goal is fat loss, the same rules are going to be applied because, like we talked about in the last video, your training style for fat loss is hypertrophy focused. The simple answer for this is as much as you can, but we're going to get into understanding training intensity, training to failure, and the RPE scale so you can know what it feels like, what it looks like to be lifting the appropriate weight for each individual lift. In the fitness space, intensity is such a big buzzword, and our definition of what true high intensity training is has been warped. It's very much a cardio focused thing. High intensity cardio is that kind of cardio where your heart rate is through the roof, you're sweating buckets, you can't catch your breath, and maybe you're even trembling a little bit. Yeah, dude, people go crazy. Like their legs are shaking, you know, that kind of thing. A lot of companies have made a living, so to speak, selling high intensity training. Think your Orange Theories, F45s, group training classes, etc. They want you to get as tired as possible, but that isn't effective training, and that isn't what high intensity resistance training looks like either. High intensity resistance training is better defined as the amount of load that you are moving. So a high intensity lift would be lifting something as heavy as you can and taking it to failure. This activates your central nervous system to the highest degree and puts you in that fight or flight response. Because in a real life situation where you are in a fight or flight response, think of having a tree fall on top of you and you have to bench press it off of you. That's kind of the same internal mechanisms that get activated when you're in the gym under a barbell trying to bench press. That is intense activity. Your heart rate might not spike as high, you might not be as out of breath, you might not be trembling by the time you're done with it, but you're putting your body through high intensity activity. And that's what you want to aim for. We're focusing on moving as much load as possible for a given number of reps. In the last video, we talked about how there's going to be different rep ranges for different exercises. So we've talked about lifting as heavy as you can, but heavy is a very subjective term, not just between you and I. My heavy might be different than your heavy, but also through sets and reps as well. If I told you to hold a glass of water out like this with your arm stretched out, you wouldn't have an issue with that. That should be pretty easy to do. But if I told you to hold that for 30 minutes, you're going to struggle to even make it that far. Your arm will fatigue at that point. The glass of water becomes too heavy to hold for that long. Even though the glass of water itself isn't very heavy for one singular rep or one moment of holding it out, it becomes heavy under the right context, and your arm will likely fail at a certain point. And this is a very popular training term that we like to use, training till failure, that you might have heard of, which is short for concentric failure. And all that means is you wouldn't be able to perform another rep of an exercise with good form even if you had a gun to your head. Training to failure helps us understand what heavy means for us in different contexts. Whether you're only lifting 3 reps or you're lifting 20 reps, the amount of weight you're lifting is going to be different, but it should be heavy for both number of reps. So there's really 2 important things you need to know about failure. Failure happens once your form starts to break. So maybe if you're doing an RDL, for instance, you're lifting a heavy weight, you got 5 reps, maybe you're still able to pick up the weight off the floor for 5 more reps, but you're using your lower back instead of your glutes and your hamstrings. That means you've exceeded failure at that point. Once your form is compromised, you've hit failure. It doesn't mean that you're not able to lift the weight anymore. It's just that you can't lift the weight the same way that you did for that first rep. The reps should be as consistent as possible from beginning to end. And 2, as I've alluded to this point, the weight you choose to reach failure depends on the number of reps. If I told you to choose a weight to bicep curl for 5 reps and you couldn't do a 6th rep, you'd choose a pretty heavy weight. Asad, what would you choose? Bicep curl 5 times. 60 for 5 reps. It would be a grind, but you'd get it. If I asked you to do 20 reps of bicep curl, you wouldn't use 60 pounds. No, you'd use probably like a 40, 30, right? Yeah, you'd reduce the load, but that would still be hard to get to 20, 100%. Yeah. So failure in this context for a 20 rep bicep curl is a 40 rep load. The weight to get to failure and the definition of heavy for both of those contexts are different, but they're still heavy for that context. And that's going to be important to keep in mind throughout your entire training program, from the metric based lift all the way to the finish. If you look at a program and it says bench press for 3 sets of 8 to 10 reps, the question you should be asking yourself is, what's the most weight that I can lift while maintaining good form for 8 to 10 reps? We use failure as a reference point for how much weight we should be lifting, but we don't want to take all of our lifts to failure. Really, we should be trying to hit failure maybe once, at most twice per training session, but we want to get really close to failure whenever possible. So if we look at failure as having 0 reps left in the tank, where again, if you had a gun to your head and I asked you to do 1 more rep, you wouldn't be able to do it. All of your exercises should be within 2 reps of that point at most. There's 2 different models that are commonly used to measure the intensity of a lift. It's the RPE scale or the RIR scale. RPE is rate of perceived exertion. RIR is rates in reserve. They both mean the same thing, just different ways of displaying it. A 10 RPE means you have 0 reps left in reserve. You couldn't do another rep no matter how hard you tried. A 9 RPE means you have 1 rep left in reserve. So maybe you could do another rep, but it would be really hard for you to do it. You'd really have to grind it out. An 8 RPE would be 2 reps in reserve. You could hit another rep for sure, maybe a second rep. And this is where you want to stay. You want to stay within 0 to 2 reps in reserve, or 8 to 10 RPE with every single lift that you're doing. So how do you know when you've reached failure? We've talked about aiming to that point and getting close to that point, but what does that look like in practice? Well, once again, if your form starts breaking, then you've reached failure. You're done doing the exercise. Pushing it further will only hurt you. But another good gauge of seeing whether or not you reach failure is if your rep speed slows down. With a bench press, for instance, or with a squat, these are common examples that you've probably seen all over the internet. You can see someone benching at a certain rate for a period of time, but when they get to that last 1 or 2 reps, it starts taking them a lot longer to make it to the top. That is when they're getting close to failure, because maybe they can do another rep that would take them twice as long to get done, but the rep speed slowed down so significantly that's probably far enough to push it. So that's where you want to get to with most of your lifts. Up to that point where you start slowing down, the last 1 to 2 reps should always be kind of a grind for you to get through. If the speed of your last rep is the same speed as your first rep, then you're not reaching failure. You have a lot more to go and you're not training to the fullest capability that you can and not getting the most out of your training. And that's the mentality you need to have when thinking about lifting heavy. In a worst case life or death situation, are you lifting as heavy as you can? Are you getting every rep possible? If the answer is no, you could probably go heavier on those lifts. I mentioned earlier, the reps should stay consistent in form, but the speed will likely and should slow down. Everybody is different. Sometimes you can't tell by looking, but you can definitely tell by feeling it. So stupid simple summary here, guy. With every single exercise that you are... Guy. Yeah, one guy. All right, so stupid simple summary here, guys. When training and looking at your training program, if a lift is asking you for 3 sets of 8 to 10 reps, the question you need to be asking yourself is, how much weight can I lift with good form that can take me to 8 to 10 reps? You should aim to have 0 to 2 reps in reserve with every single lift that you're doing, and the final reps will always be slowed down. If your form ever breaks, then you've already reached failure and you need to stop there. I hope you found this helpful. The Stupid Fit training app is going to be coming soon. If you want to stay up to date with that, join the Mighty Networks community that is in the description below so that you can be the first to try it out once it is released. And until next time, stay stupid.